Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today, we're going to be finishing up R.F. Kuang's Poppy War trilogy with The Burning God. And wow, what a way to end things.
Yeah, it's certainly an explosive finale.
Yeah.
Kuang doesn't shy away from the brutal realities of war, the psychological toll it takes on individuals and nations, and the seductive, but ultimately destructive nature of power.
Right. It's not just a war story. It's about what happens when a young woman named Rin, who starts out just wanting a better life, becomes a powerful shaman fueled by the phoenix, a god of destruction. Imagine being chosen by a force like that, a force that could level cities. You're wrestling with incredible power, intense trauma, and impossible choices.
And that's one of the things that makes this book so compelling. It explores those big, timeless themes, the cost of war, the burden of leadership, the struggle for identity. Through Rin's journey, it forces us to confront those uncomfortable questions about what happens when good intentions pave the road to hell.
It's definitely a wild ride, and I think it's best if we start at the beginning with Rin's descent into darkness. She starts out as this determined student, driven to escape poverty and make something of herself. But then the war with the Mujanese explodes, and she witnesses horrific atrocities that change her forever.
This is where we see the cyclical nature of violence begin to take hold. Rin's initial motivations are understandable. She's fighting for survival for her people. But as the war escalates, her methods become increasingly brutal, fueled by a desire for vengeance. There's that chilling scene where she forces captured Mujanese soldiers to choose between serving her or watching their families die. It's a stark reminder of how war can twist even the most compassionate individuals, pushing them to make impossible choices.
Yeah, that scene was tough to read for sure. What really struck me was how the narration itself changes along with Rin. As she delves deeper into this darkness, the language becomes fragmented, chaotic. There are moments where you're not even sure what's real and what's a figment of her opium-fueled hallucinations.
Exactly. Kuang masterfully uses the writing style to mirror Rin's psychological state. It becomes this stream of consciousness, almost like we're trapped inside her spiraling mind. And this unreliable narrator aspect raises some interesting questions for the reader. How much of what we're seeing is actually happening? And how much is distorted by Rin's trauma and her reliance on opium?
Right, it's like, are we seeing the world as it is or the world as Rin perceives it? And as she becomes more entangled with the Phoenix, those lines get even blurrier. The Phoenix offers her immense strength, the power to take revenge on those who have wronged her people. But it feeds on her rage and pain, threatening to consume her entirely.
That's a fantastic point. It's almost like a dark reflection of how we all cope with difficult situations. We all have our coping mechanisms right. But Rin's reliance on the phoenix and opium underscores the sheer magnitude of her trauma and the seductive allure of power, especially when it offers a way to strike back at those who have hurt you.
It also raises that question of how much control she really has over her actions. Is she truly making choices, or is she being manipulated by the Phoenix?
I think that's a question that haunts Rin throughout the book. On one hand, she craves the power the Phoenix offers. It allows her to protect those she cares about and inflict righteous vengeance. But on the other, she fears becoming a monster, consumed by its destructive impulses.
It's almost like she's being torn in two different directions. And then she gets pulled even further down this path when she seeks out the trifecta, these legendary shamans, Daji, Jiang, and Riga, who are basically the embodiment of power and ambition.
The trifecta is fascinating because they represent different facets of power and the choices Rin faces. Daji, the cunning poisoner, is all about manipulation and using whatever means necessary to achieve her goals. She sees in Rin a kindred spirit, someone willing to cross lines others wouldn't.
And there's that revealing conversation where Rin confronts Daji about her fear of Riga, the most powerful and dangerous of the trifecta. Daji's response, "I am not afraid of him," is so telling. It's almost like she's trying to convince herself as much as Rin. It highlights the inherent dangers of unchecked power, and how even those who wield it can become consumed by fear.
And it immediately ties into those larger themes of how women in particular navigate power structures. Daji's influence on Rin is both a mentorship and a cautionary tale. Think about how often women throughout history have had to resort to less direct, more manipulative tactics to gain influence because they were excluded from traditional avenues of power.
It's like the men are out there battling on the front lines, but Daji is waging war with whispers and poisons.
Precisely. And Rin, as she walks this tightrope between liberation and destruction, is drawn to both of those approaches, constantly wrestling with the consequences of her choices.
And those consequences get pretty heavy when the Southern Coalition, Rin's army, achieves a major victory at the Belay Mountains. There are brutal reprisals against Mujini's collaborators. Rin is right there in the thick of it, participating in acts of violence that would have been unthinkable to her just a few years earlier.
This victory, as decisive as it is, forces us to ask a tough question. At what point does a righteous cause become tainted by the methods used? Rin started out fighting for survival, for liberation, but is she becoming the very monster she set out to defeat?
And it's not just her. Even Kite, her childhood friend and the voice of reason in the group, struggles with these moral dilemmas. He argues for a more humane treatment of prisoners. But he's met with resistance from both Rin and Suji, another key figure in the Southern Coalition.
This is where we see the tension between idealism and pragmatism play out. Kite represents hope, compassion, the possibility of a better future. But he's also forced to confront the brutal realities of a war that's been fueled by generations of hatred and resentment.
I think this conflict is something that resonates with everyone on some level. We all want to believe in the good in humanity, but then we're confronted with the darkness, the capacity for cruelty that exists in all of us.
And that's one of the things that makes The Burning God such a powerful and thought-provoking read. It forces us to confront those uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the world we live in.
Absolutely. It's not a book that shies away from difficult questions. And it's a wild ride. Rin goes through some intense stuff. One of the most poignant moments for me was when she visits her childhood home after the battle. Her family's gone, her community's devastated. You really feel the weight of the war's impact, the personal loss that gets buried under the grand narratives of victory and defeat.
It's a powerful reminder that behind every statistic, every battle report, there are individual stories of loss, grief, and trauma. And Rin's attempt to exhume the remains of her family, that just speaks to the desperation, the need to find some sense of closure, some connection to the life she's lost.
And it connects back to that idea we talked about earlier about the cyclical nature of violence. She's trying to find peace, trying to reclaim some piece of her past. But she's already so deeply entrenched in the cycle of revenge.
Right, and it highlights that idea that sometimes, even when you win, you lose.
Such a heavy scene. Kuang really knows how to pack an emotional punch.
She's a master of her craft. I especially appreciate how she weaves in elements of Nakara culture and mythology to enrich the storytelling.
That's one of the things I wanted to ask you about.
Sir, what were you thinking about?
You know, the way she uses language to reflect the power dynamics at play. Like the Nakara language is described as being more nuanced, more evocative,
Yeah.
compared to the Hesperian language, which is more direct and utilitarian. What do you make of that?
I think it's a subtle but brilliant way of highlighting the cultural clash at the heart of the conflict. You have the Nakara with their deep history valuing subtlety and tradition. And then you have the Hesperians, these technologically advanced colonizers, who favor efficiency and control even in their language. It's almost like their language reflects their desire to impose their worldview on others.
That's a great point. It's not just about conquering land. It's about conquering minds and cultures.
Exactly. And it ties into that larger theme of colonialism that runs throughout the book. The Hesperians, with their advanced technology and their belief in their own superiority, are a clear parallel to real-world colonial powers. And Rin's rebellion is as much about resisting their cultural dominance as it is about fighting for political freedom.
It's like she's fighting for the soul of her nation, not just its territory. There's that scene where Rin argues with Daji about collaborating with the Hesperians. And Daji says the Nakara are too backward to govern themselves. It's like a textbook example of how colonizers justify their actions, right?
Absolutely. It's that classic colonial narrative, the white man's burden, the idea that indigenous populations need to be civilized by their conquerors, and Rin's rejection of that narrative. Her fierce belief in the strength and resilience of her people is one of the most powerful aspects of her character.
She's not just fighting for survival. She's fighting for the right of her people to determine their own destiny.
And that fight takes a toll on her. As the war drags on, we see her becoming increasingly reliant on the trifecta, allowing their influence to shape her decisions and actions. It's almost like she's sacrificing her own agency in exchange for the power to defeat her enemies.
Like a Faustian bargain, right?
Yeah.
She gets the power, but at what cost?
And that's the question that haunts Rin throughout the book. Is she truly in control? Or is she becoming a pawn in a larger game, manipulated by forces she doesn't fully understand?
It's definitely a question that stays with you. I mean, we've talked a lot about Rin.
Right.
What about the secondary characters? They're pretty complex too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Take Suji, for instance. He starts as this charming, roguish figure. But as the war progresses, we see a darker side emerge. He becomes incredibly ruthless. driven by pragmatism to the point of cruelty.
Yeah, and his betrayal of Rin is one of the most shocking moments in the book.
It is, and it speaks to that slippery slope of power. Suji adapts to the brutal realities of war, believing that any means are justified if they lead to victory.
He's constantly telling Rin she's too soft, too idealistic, right?
Exactly. He
Huh.
represents the seductive power of expediency, the belief that the ends justify the means. And it makes you wonder, is he a villain? Or is he just a product of a system that rewards ruthlessness?
I think that's one of the things that makes The Burning Gods so challenging. There are no easy answers, no clear-cut heroes and villains. It forces you to confront the complexities of human nature, the gray areas of morality.
And that's what makes it such a compelling and ultimately devastating read.
Totally agree. So we've talked about Rin's descent, the trifecta, the moral dilemmas of war, and the impact on the characters. What else is there?
Well, the final confrontation is still to come. And that's where things get really intense. We see the full extent of Rin's power, the destructive force she's become, and the tragic consequences of her choices.
Yeah. We can't forget about the final battle. It's epic and heartbreaking all at the same time. But we'll save that for the next part of our deep dive,
Definitely. There's still a lot to unpack.
for sure. We'll be back soon to dive into the climax of The Burning God.
Until then, think about this. In a world where the lines between good and evil are so blurred, can there ever truly be peace without sacrifice?
Keep those pages turning.
Welcome back. Last time we left off with Rin facing the consequences of her victory at the Belay Mountains. She's struggling with the moral weight of her actions and the growing influence of the trifecta, and things are about to get even more complicated as she heads towards that final confrontation.
You're not kidding. The tension just keeps ratcheting up, and all those questions about power control and sacrifice, they become front and center as Rin marches towards the capital city.
This is where we see Kuang's world building really shine. She doesn't shy away from showing the devastating impact of war on both the landscape and the people. Remember that scene where Rin travels through Tikani, the city, where she started her journey? It's a powerful moment of disillusionment for her. The place is in ruins, a shell of its former self.
It's like a physical manifestation of the destruction that's happening inside of her. The old world, the life she knew, is gone. And there's no going back. She can't just wash her hands of the blood she spilled, the choices she's made.
Precisely. It's a turning point for her. She realizes the magnitude of the task ahead, the weight of responsibility that comes with leadership. It's no longer about personal ambition or even revenge. It's about the fate of an entire nation. And in that moment, she makes a choice. She embraces the power of the phoenix, completely knowing it could consume her.
It's both terrifying and exhilarating to watch. And this is where the book's exploration of gender roles gets really interesting. Remember, Rin is constantly underestimated, dismissed as a little girl, even as she wields this incredible power.
It's infuriating. But it also speaks to a broader truth about how women in positions of power are often perceived. They have to fight harder, be more ruthless to be taken seriously. And Rin embracing this destructive, traditionally masculine force like the phoenix is almost like a commentary on that very dynamic.
You know, it makes me think of leaders like Margaret Thatcher, who was nicknamed the Iron Lady for her uncompromising style. Or even someone like Cleopatra, who is both revered and feared for her power and cunning.
Those are excellent comparisons. History is full of examples of women who have defied expectations and wielded power in unconventional ways. And Rin is definitely part of that lineage. But her embrace of the phoenix also raises those uncomfortable questions about the cost of power, especially for women.
Right. Like, is she conforming to patriarchal expectations by becoming this destructive force? Or is she subverting them by claiming power on her own terms?
It's a complex question with no easy answer, and I think that's what makes Rin's character so compelling. She defies categorization. She's both a liberator and a destroyer, a victim and a perpetrator. She's a reflection of the messy, contradictory nature of humanity itself.
And that complexity is mirrored in her relationships, especially with the trifecta. They're not just mentors. They're almost like fragmented parts of her own personality. Daji represents her cunning Jiang, her discipline, and Riga, her raw power.
That's such a great way to put it. They're almost like the three witches in Macbeth, whispering temptations and stoking the flames of her ambition. And as she gets closer to them, she loses more and more of herself.
It's like they're feeding on her, draining her of her humanity in exchange for power. And it all culminates in that epic, terrifying battle at Aro.
Oh, that battle. It's breathtaking in scope, and Kuang's writing is just phenomenal in these scenes. Remember that line? She was simply writing reality. She was painting. She pointed and balloons incinerated.
Chills. That's exactly how I felt reading it. The imagery, The sheer destructive force, it's awe-inspiring and terrifying at the same time. It's like witnessing a force of nature unleashed.
And it speaks to the duality of fire as a symbol. It's both creative and destructive, life-giving and life-taking. Rin, fueled by the phoenix, embodies that duality. She's capable of incredible acts of heroism and horrifying acts of violence.
And it's in this battle that she truly becomes the burning god, right?
Exactly. It's the culmination of her journey, the full realization of her power. But it's also the point of no return. She's crossed a line, and there's no going back.
And it's heartbreaking because in that moment of ultimate power, she also loses everything.
That's the tragedy of Rin's story. She achieves her goals, defeats her enemies, but at a terrible cost. She sacrificed her humanity, her relationships, even her own life in the process.
You mentioned sacrifice earlier. It feels like that's one of the core themes of the book, the sacrifices we make for power, for love, for our ideals.
Absolutely. It's woven throughout the narrative. Think about Kite, who sacrifices his idealism for the sake of pragmatism, or Venka, who sacrifices her life for Rin, or even the Psyche, those elite warriors who are willing to die for their leader.
So you're saying that sacrifice is an unavoidable part of war, of achieving any kind of meaningful change.
I think Kuang is suggesting that it's an inherent part of the human experience, not just war. We all make sacrifices every day, big and small. The question is, what are we willing to sacrifice? And what are the consequences of those sacrifices?
That's a great question, and one that I think a lot of readers will grapple with after finishing this book.
I agree. And it speaks to the enduring power of the burning god. It's not just an action-packed fantasy novel. It's a story about the human condition, the choices we make, and the consequences we face.
Okay, so we've talked about Ren's journey, the themes of power and sacrifice, the final battle, but there's still one piece of the puzzle missing, the ending. What happens after the dust settles at Arlong?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. And it's a discussion best saved for the final part of our deep dive.
You're killing me with the suspense. But okay, I guess we can leave our listeners hanging for a little bit longer.
Just a little bit. We'll be back soon to unravel the ending of The Burning God and discuss its lasting impact.
Until then, keep those pages turning. All right, we're back. We've talked about Rin's transformation, the epic battles, the morally gray choices. But what about the ending of The Burning God? That's what we're here to unravel.
And what an ending it is. Kuang doesn't give us a neat little bow to tie things up. Instead, she leaves us with this haunting image of Neza cradling Rin's dying body in the aftermath of the battle.
Yeah, it's such a powerful scene. Here's this guy who, for most of the book, is driven by ambition, convinced that he's the only one who can save Nikan. And now he's lost everything, his friend, his ideals, his sense of purpose. It's like the weight of his choices has finally crushed him.
That's what makes the ending so impactful. It flips the narrative. We've been so focused on Rin's journey, her descent into darkness, that we almost forget about the people she leaves in her wake. Neza's final moments are a stark reminder that there are always casualties in war, even for those who think they're on the winning side.
It's like Rin's story is a cautionary tale, but it's also a mirror reflecting back on Neza. They both start with good intentions, a desire to make the world a better place, but they get seduced by power, blinded by their own ambitions, and in the end, they both lose themselves.
Remember that line from earlier in the book where Neza's father warns him, "It's too heavy, and you aren't strong enough." It's almost prophetic. Neza tries to shoulder the burden of an entire nation to control the course of history, but he collapses under the pressure.
And it makes you wonder, is that the inevitable fate of anyone who seeks power? Are we all doomed to be corrupted by it?
I think Kuang is suggesting that power itself isn't inherently good or evil. It's a tool. It can be used to build or destroy, to liberate or oppress. The real danger lies in how we wield it, the choices we make in its pursuit.
Right. Rin and Neza both make choices that lead to destruction, but they do it for different reasons. Rin is driven by trauma, by a desire for vengeance. Neza is driven by ambition, by a belief in his own righteousness.
And their contrasting approaches highlight the importance of self-awareness, of understanding our own motivations and biases.
Yeah.
Because if we're not careful, those very things can blind us to the consequences of our actions.
You know, it's interesting how the book ends, not with a grand proclamation or a sweeping resolution, but with this quiet, introspective moment. We're left with Neza grieving, questioning everything he thought he knew. It's like Kuang's inviting us to do the same, to reflect on the complexities of war power and the human condition.
And that's what makes The Burning God so much more than just a fantasy novel. It's a story that lingers in your mind long after you've finished reading it. It makes you question your own beliefs, your own assumptions about the world.
It's definitely a book that sparked a lot of conversation for me. both internally and with other readers. It challenges you to confront uncomfortable truths about humanity, about the seductive nature of power,
Mm.
and the cyclical nature of violence.
I think that's the hallmark of truly great literature. It doesn't offer easy answers or pat solutions. Instead, it presents us with complex questions and challenges us to grapple with them on our own terms.
And that's exactly what The Burning God does. It leaves you with a sense of unease, a recognition that even in victory, there's always a cost. And it forces you to consider what you might be willing to sacrifice for the things you believe in.
And on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up our deep dive into this incredible book. I hope this conversation has given you some new insights into the themes and ideas explored in The Burning God, and maybe even inspired you to revisit the book with fresh eyes.
Thanks for joining us on this journey through the world of The Burning God. It's been an intense but rewarding experience, and I hope you found it as thought-provoking as we have.
Until next time, keep reading, keep questioning, and keep those critical thinking skills sharp.
Happy reading, everyone!